You're listening to Strategic Wisdom with Andrew Jose. Strategic Wisdom is a foreign affairs and politics podcast brought to you by me, Andrew Jose, a Washington, D.C. based security policy analyst and news reporter, bringing you timely analyses and commentary on issues in international relations, war, and security policy. The War on Terror was one of the most transformative events in American history, transforming how Americans viewed and discussed privacy, national security, and grand strategy. Indeed, many of the institutional reforms now conspicuous, such as the Department of Homeland Security, came to be in the period following the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. The influence of the War on Terror does not extend to the administrative state. A record number of veterans from the global War on Terror are entering Congress, and they are influencing policy, working hand in hand with each other and other partners in solving issues related to veterans' healthcare and foreign policy. Joining me today is Jeffrey Lantis, author of the book Staying in the Fight: How War on Terror Veterans in Congress Are Shaping U.S. Defense Policy, published earlier this August by the University Press of Kentucky. I and Lantis are going to discuss how war on terror veterans, as the title suggests, are staying in the fight and influencing U.S. defense policy. Without further ado, let's head to the interview. Jeffrey Lantis is professor of political science and the chair of the International Relations program at the College of Wooster in Ohio. He has extensive international study and travel experience, having recently served as a J. William Fulbright Senior Scholar at the Australian National University. He's the author of the books The Life and Death of International Treaties, published in 2008, and co-editor of Foreign Policy in Comparative Perspective. He's also the author of The New International Studies Classroom, Active Teaching, Active Learning. Furthermore, Lantis has also published numerous articles and book chapters on strategic culture, transatlantic relations, and foreign policy analysis. His most recent work, and the subject of the interview, is Staying in the Fight: How War on Terror Veterans in Congress Are Shaping U.S. Defense Policy. Jeffrey Lantis, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here with you.
So Jeffrey, what were some of the motivations that led you to write this book? Why is it that we need to have the conversation you are bringing to the table in your work now at this moment and time?
Well, thanks so much for the question, Andrew. And I'm happy to have an opportunity to talk more about my research and about this new book, which is focused on war on terror veterans and their activism on foreign and defense policy. I mean, an easy way to answer the question is to say this is incredibly timely and important because we are seeing in American politics and society the direct impact of war on terror veterans who are now involved in the policy process and shaping some decisions associated with the military and defense policy, etc. I mean, one of my original motivations, of course, is to honor and recognize the contributions of veterans in all aspects of our society, and directly kind of in the policy process. And I've been so interested in this in general over the years and wanted to understand these dynamics, in particular, the activism of this new generation of veterans on Capitol Hill. And I found their stories to be really interesting and compelling. I mean, you asked about direct motivations. I would say, in very direct terms, I got interested in and focused on this research back in the 2010s. I was doing research for another book, a previous book, in 2017 in Washington, D.C. I was up on Capitol Hill. I was talking to all kinds of interesting individuals, members of Congress, staffers, and some experts around Washington about foreign policy entrepreneurship and advocacy. And that previous project was focused on how younger or newer members of Congress were arriving in Washington and making a difference in some key foreign policy areas. Their activism and engagement was significant. And, in those conversations, again, back in 2017, with a lot of people around Washington, D.C., I was hearing time and time again that some of the most interesting and influential newer members of Congress were veterans of the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, or service after 9/11. And I got kind of intrigued. I got kind of curious about that. A quick example would be Senator Tammy Duckworth. She's from Illinois. She was elected to Congress back in 2012. But Tammy Duckworth, as some of our listeners will probably know, was in active duty service. She was flying a helicopter back in 2004 in Iraq when she was grievously wounded. She then took years to recover, but in this process got more and more interested in trying to influence and shape defense policy. So back in the 2010s, I'm doing that research and I'm really interested in what this new generation could be about. And just to extend it a little bit further, so that led me to try to learn as much as I could about this new generation of veterans who were coming to Capitol Hill with some really unique experiences. And so I set out to try to learn what I could, gather information, and make some orderly sense of it for this new book, Staying in the Fight. And, I found some really interesting things along the way. I mean, theoretically, I was interested in and curious about debates in the scholarship, in particular in the civil-military relations literature, debates about whether prior military experience really mattered to influence foreign and defense policy, whether or not those factors were significant in shaping their motivation and engagement. So historically and theoretically, I was beginning to connect these themes together and develop out a plan for further investigation. Historically, for example, veterans and who were involved in the policy process have always been around in American history. Historically, we see examples of this, of course, right after the Revolutionary War, when dozens of the newly elected first members of Congress in the United States were veterans. And then throughout the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, we see active involvement of veterans in politics and in their influence in trying to shape the policy process. The high water mark in recent or contemporary times was in the Vietnam War era. Long about 1972 or 73, we see the highest concentration of veterans involved on Capitol Hill in Congress. Something like 73 or 74% of all members of Congress had some sort of prior military experience. And that, of course, all builds up and leads me to want to understand this generation in a direct way, and the characteristics of the generation, their activism, and their involvement. And let me just share just a few tidbits about what I've picked up on by focusing on this generation. Many of our listeners may know that there are a large number of war on terror veterans of military service after 9/11, broadly defined. There are something like 4 million veterans that fit into this category. And then some of them have become actively involved in the policy process and pursue their activism along the way. But those veterans from those wars, for example, Iraq and Afghanistan, also have some pretty profound experiences that they've begun to try to process and shape and make sense of. There are significant percentages that influence the way that they might see the world. For example, 77% of all war on terror veterans were deployed at least once in the post-9/11 era. So they've got deployments. And some units, of course, deployed more frequently in significant ways, shaping their experience further. 49, almost 50%, half of all war on terror veterans report that they've had some sort of combat experience, either in direct connection or close proximity to. There are also some really tough statistics that help to define this war on terror generation. More than 15% or so, 16% of all Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans have screened positive for post-traumatic stress. About 500,000 veterans suffered from traumatic brain injuries and other characteristics. And all of those characteristics then put together help us to think about how those background experiences might influence policy activism and concerns of members of Congress elected thereafter. The last thing I'll share in response to your question is, timely and important, right? Among the first war on terror veterans elected to Congress in 2006 was a guy named Tim Walz. Tim Walz, the current vice presidential candidate in the Democratic Party. As we speak, Andrew, this week during the Democratic National Convention, we see him prominently featured. He is a war on terror veteran who drew on that experience. Today, we see the largest concentration of veterans with similar military experiences, the war on terror generation on Capitol Hill, numbering 51 elected to the 117th Congress, and now 56 members of Congress in the last couple of years are war on terror veterans. Oh, and the last thing I'll mention is that one of those veterans recently elected to Congress is another person very much in the news. His name is J.D. Vance. So I'll stop there, Andrew.
What policy areas today that you'd say these veterans have had an active role in shaping?
So the kinds of foreign policy and defense policy issue areas that war on terror veterans have been directly interested in, connected to, and engaged in tend to be associated with military deployments and concerns of veterans and currently serving soldiers all around the world. The issue areas that I focused on for my book are foreign and defense policy issues of engagement or commitments of military force in several cases, and then veterans' health care and veterans' affairs as additional categories. Quick examples, I'll just mention a couple in passing, right? The war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, launched, motivated so many war on terror veterans who were in Congress on Capitol Hill to become engaged and involved on these issues. An interesting example of that to me was the fact that in the months leading up to the Ukraine invasion, when the war drums were rumbling, when it looked like there might be trouble in that area, some members of Congress conducted delegation visits to Ukraine to reassert U.S. American support for the Ukrainians in the face of that threat. One CODEL, as they call it, congressional delegation visit in the winter right before the invasion, consisted of a couple of war on terror veterans across the political aisle. Ruben Gallego, Democrat from Arizona, went on the CODEL with Seth Moulton from Massachusetts, along with Mike Waltz from Florida. These Republicans and Democrats shared a common commitment to and concern about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since then, they've continued to be involved in active support for encouraging strong U.S. military backing of Ukraine. Oh, but one more thing. They also share a common view on a critical question or dimension of the crisis at hand, and that is they all agree in a bipartisan way that there should be no U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine. So looking for commonalities in foreign and defense policy challenges like the Ukraine war is a really good example. The evacuation of Afghanistan in 2021 is an issue that mobilized, that really activated bipartisan war on terror veteran engagement, concerns, and support for the best possible response to a tragic and chaotic situation. And then Veterans Affairs and Healthcare, a common concern across the board for so many war on terror veterans and, of course, other generations of veterans who serve on Capitol Hill. A commitment to try to provide the best care possible for returning veterans, like those percentage of veterans I mentioned a minute ago with post-traumatic stress disorder, like other veterans suffering from health effects from exposure to toxic burn pits during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars.
Was it the PACT Act?
Indeed, the PACT Act is a great example of a bipartisan commitment to come together to provide a response, in this case, to the toxic burn pit issue, right? Which has been really beleaguered the military for 10 or 20 years. What a tragic situation. If I could just say a little more about that, Andrew, this is a real tough, right? It has been a practice of the military up to just recently, in fact, that for things like waste management, their goal was to leave nothing behind in military deployments. So in deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, what you'd see outside of large U.S. military installations were open landfill-like burn pits in which all kinds of things were being destroyed, right? Removed. And in the process, carcinogens were being launched into the air, pollutants, and these pollutant clouds in some cases, toxic plumes, as they're described by advocates who are concerned about it, could affect soldiers in the area. The obvious connection here, tragically, is to Beau Biden, the son of the current president of the United States, Joe Biden, who died in 2015 from a rare form of brain cancer that many experts have suggested can be linked back to exposure to toxic burn pits, including when Beau Biden was in theater in 2008. Yeah.
So before we discuss your model that you develop in this book, most, if not all, social science models tend to have outliers. So when you were conducting your research, what were some notable outliers you noticed that didn't really stick to the general model and that you had to exclude in order to build a model?
So when we think about a kind of political science or social science approach to any really interesting issue or question, we're trying to arrange variables in a nice, orderly way that makes clear connections between, say, the causal factors and their effects in a policy process, or their effects on an international issue like cooperation or conflict. So we line up these variables and we think about the intervariate relationships. And in my case, I can describe the model in just a few minutes, but I recognize that what we're looking for assumes certain things, right? It assumes that there are socialization experiences that should be significant for war on terror veterans. So that made me think hard about what I would define as and rule in versus rule out in terms of military service and experience. An easy question, for example, that I did not fully develop in this study, but became whether or not we would include both those soldiers who had served active duty deployments in war zones and those soldiers who were simply activated, were involved in National Guard or Reserve operations, maybe even just deployed in the United States of America, in incredibly important support roles, but different, if you will, from intense combat experiences in the mountains of Afghanistan. So questions about what to rule in or rule out helped shape my development of the model for sure. There's another question, too, that I found fascinating, and that is whether or not we should focus primarily on foreign and defense policy versus domestic policy issues. And I'll come back around to that, I think, when we talk a little bit more about my ongoing research in a little bit. But I was intrigued by the question of whether or not there was a difference, if you will, beyond the water's edge as to what should be included or not. And finally, another issue that came up in my variable development was what kind of instruments I would look at as relevant for those activated and concerned war on terror veterans to use or employ in their effort to try to shape policy. What do I rule in or out of the model? So thanks for your question. I really like thinking about that out loud.
In Staying in the Fight, you describe these war on terror veterans who, despite having disagreements vastly on other issues, as having policy areas they converge on. And you also attribute in-service socialization as a cause for this convergence. How does socialization in the military, from your research, necessarily influence and bring about this convergence?
Yeah, that question helps to kind of link us into some really interesting debates in the civil-military relations literature. And these debates have been going on, in fact, for decades. So I appreciate the question. It is ultimately this issue of whether or not socialization has a direct and significant effect on policy activism and engagement versus other factors, considerations, or experiences. So in the civil military relations literature, in articles you might see published in journals like Armed Forces and Society, scholars tend to refer to this as the socialization versus self-selection debate. It's a really interesting question as to whether or not it's military socialization that matters most, that brings people together to find areas of common concern, or it's some original and base motivation, a personal or political ideology an individual has that maybe, for example, makes them more likely to want to join the military in the first place. So that socialization question really permeates a lot of what I was interested in and trying to understand better. And boy, that's very significant in kind of today's era, right, of extreme partisanship and polarization in Washington and beyond. So the socialization literature would argue that indeed these experiences are significant in influencing common perspectives, a sense of commonality about certain issues or concerns when it comes to foreign policy and defense policy. The argument goes that things like military training are formative, that they help promote an idea of shared experience, of collective consideration or concern, and help guide individuals who come through that process toward certain things. We'll build on that and say this. The military experiences that individuals have often then serve as formative influences, maybe, heuristics to help them kind of process, creating lenses through which they see subsequent questions or experiences. And so when I was set about doing my research, I was conducting interviews, I was asking questions about to what extent there were commonalities in generational effects. I heard an interesting range of perspectives on this question, but I do want to emphasize this part. When I talk to veterans themselves about this question of whether or not they believe the experience was socializing and powerful for them, universally the answer was yes. Members of Congress, staffers, experts, and other veterans around Washington and beyond all tend to believe that those experiences were particularly formative. And I've got some fun quotes in the book that capture the spirit of that, right? Where we have veterans on Capitol Hill saying, we intuitively get each other. We see one another. When we run into others on Capitol Hill, we know that they've had common experiences, and we believe that that creates certain perspectives or skill sets, especially, right, when it comes to actual cases of foreign and defense policy decisions, like deployments of soldiers abroad, or creating situations where soldiers might face risk or danger. Limitations, then, that grow, arguably, out of those socialization experiences.
If you were to put your model in one sentence or two or three sentences describing, let's say, the dependent variables and the independent variables, how would you put it?
Yeah, this is a model that focuses on whether military socialization experiences for individuals who are elected to Congress after service in the War on Terror employ certain strategies to try to influence foreign and defense policy outcomes. And those strategies include a couple of key elements that I developed in my model. That is, linking personal and policy narratives together. Right, drawing connections between their experience and the issue at hand. That includes formal legislation and bipartisanship. And it also includes a really creative strategy for enterprising foreign policy entrepreneurs. And that is creating advocacy coalitions, lining up with other groups with similar concerns inside and outside of the political process to try to push for influence. That advocacy coalition building or grassroots development is a fascinating additional dimension of their activism.
So, your model explains the relationship between a Congress member being a veteran and the influence they exert on U.S. defense policy. How generalizable you say this model would be? Would you think this model, if some modifications are made, could help determine how past practitioner experience in other fields, like healthcare, for example, will influence a policymaker's mark in other policy areas once they come to the legislature.
So indeed, that's one of the original motivations that drove me into the project. I like thinking with you out loud here about kind of a social scientific route or avenue for investigation. Coming out of my prior book back in 2017, the research that I did for that book on foreign policy advocacy by young and entrepreneurial members of Congress, I got interested in this question of whether groups of all kinds with distinctive experiences might then be able to bring those to bear in active policy influence. So I would argue that it is indeed generalizable if you make certain adjustments and modifications in the model like you hinted at. For example, we could imagine connections between past experiences for groups of individuals that fall into certain demographic categories, gender categories, or service or professional experience categories. I was intrigued, by the way, in some of my research by past experiences that influenced other advocates for foreign policy changes. A great example there would be Senator Chris Coons. Senator Chris Coons from Delaware, arguably Joe Biden's best friend, was an active, involved member of Congress back in the 2010s who came to Congress with past religious service experience. He had mission service experience, including spending time in Africa, that he brought to bear directly on Capitol Hill when they needed expertise about how the United States should deal with a public health crisis. That is the tragic outbreak of the Ebola virus in West Africa. Chris Coons drew on his missionary and religious service experience in shaping Obama policy responses to that tragedy. So yes, we could play out these ideas in interesting ways and make connections between socialization experiences and policy activism, arguably in all kinds of potential categories.
In Staying in the Fight's introduction, you paraphrase research by Daniel Lupton, where Lupton argues that lower representation of veterans among members of Congress correlates with a decreased legislative willingness to rein in on the White House on foreign policy matters, particularly on issues relating to restraint. Now, many pro-restraint scholars and activists have proposed, some seriously, some in jest, that it may be a good thing for this country's foreign policy to require Congress members to have military experience prior to contesting in elections, lest Congress be filled with what is known in political speak as, quote, chicken hawks. What are your thoughts on this argument that Lupton makes, but also what many pro-restraint activists and scholars say in jest?
Yeah, that's great. Really an interesting line of argument, right? We could play this out in a couple of different ways. First, let me, though, give credit where credit is due. Daniel Lupton is a terrific scholar and a friend of my work, has been really supportive and helpful for me in thinking about it. Daniel Lupton works up at Colgate University, and she and other colleagues, people like Lindsay Cohn and Jessica Blankshane, Heidi Urban at Georgetown, Jeremy Teigen, and others, were so helpful in shaping the ideas that I had formulated to try to make the connections that I could. So I do want to give credit where credit is due, a little acknowledgement out there. But let me get to your question, because Lupton's research is more focused, rich, and nuanced than some of the civil-military relations arguments that are out there. She was also interested in this question, right? Does military service experience, does socialization influence policy activism? And while she addressed a wide variety of arguments and connections that people have made, she drilled down on a particular question. Do veterans pursue active engagement in trying to restrain or restrict presidents in their war powers and decisions on use of military force? And what she found was that there are significant veteran constraints imposed on presidential decisions regarding military power. So, if you will, she found argument for support for the idea that checks and balances do matter, and that they especially do matter in cases associated with executive excess, right? But let me speak to the question in a different way, too, because it raises an interesting question about whether military experiences for all should be good, helpful, could be a constructive way to build a heuristic and a sense of experience for veterans, for members of Congress. A different way to put that would be, do we need more veterans in Congress? The answer to this question is really fascinating because it depends on what groups you talk to about that. Some veterans advocacy groups say clearly the answer is yes. They say that veterans bring those skills that we're talking about, we've been discussing, to policy decisions. They're conditioned by experiences. They know how to overcome challenges and obstacles. They're great problem solvers. They've experienced a wide variety of challenges, and they've come together with people who are different than them to try to solve them. So in this way, service and sacrifice, yes, right? Let's support that idea. How about that? We're addressing problems. Arguments about veterans being more bipartisan in their approach also relates to this broader question. Maybe, just maybe, if veterans have those experiences, if everybody has those experiences, we'd be more inclined to engage in cooperation and be more bipartisan in our approach. But now let me throw in the complications of the tumult and the chaos of today's polarized and partisan system, right? And then so if we start to worry or you start to raise questions associated with this, you quickly slide into territory in the debates in civil military relations about politicization of the military. Or let's turn that around, militarization of the polity. Critics have raised all kinds of questions and concerns about whether or not there could be too much influence of the military in daily affairs, civilian concerns in a place like the United States, and foreign and defense policy. Just to put a fine point on that question, it is possible that members of the military, that veterans who come to Washington, some of whom continue to be working officers and soldiers in the Guard and Reserve, might be biased in their policy positions toward or in favor of certain things that they believe in. So this question of militarization or politicization is real and remains a hot point of debate.
An interesting point you mentioned in the book is that these war on terror veterans have a common language, that they just get each other. Perhaps this hints at socialization as the solution needed to bridge the polarized differences in American politics. Political scientists have long discussed this, associating polarization and political sectarianism as stemming from the lack of shared spaces and activities in our communities, be it like the church and so on. In many ways, I'd argue the lack of shared spaces has resulted in two or more kinds of Americas, each speaking a different political and ideological language because of fractured experiences and a deterioration of shared spaces, either due to technology or for some other reasons. What are your thoughts on this idea?
Well, this idea is so important and such an interesting question because it gets at broader concerns about where our society is at and where we're headed, about the lack or the limited number of common experiences and common spaces in which we can enjoy civil political discourse. And so when we think about veterans' experiences, processing their common experiences and influencing their policy positions, there is a sense of kind of unity of understanding, of commonality. You know, like you said, it's really a quote in my book, right? Veterans say, we just get each other. We understand where each other is coming from, even across the political aisle, and they cooperate in some significant ways. And the book describes all kinds of interesting case studies of that level of collaboration. In the chaos of the evacuation from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021, we saw war on terror veterans who were serving up on Capitol Hill mobilize together to try to create networks for response to help rescue Americans and Afghans who had helped the American cause from the cauldron, the crucible of the challenge that was the chaos of the Afghan withdrawal, bipartisanship and cooperation on veterans' healthcare issues and concerns. So if we play out this idea that common experiences can create a kind of sense of socialization, that there are strong effects that promote kind of a sense of unity, we could imagine common experiences being significant or formative in lots of ways. Oh, by the way, this makes me think about internationally, right? Comparatively around the world, countries where there is compulsory military service. Surely that creates a commonality of experience, a sense of shared understandings of priorities and socialization experiences. Here we're talking about countries like Israel, South Korea, Denmark, Greece, Turkey. You see a lot of arguments about that then in the civil-military relations that push us through. But I want to take a twist or a turn in this discussion theme and say this. It may be that we see some commonality in perspectives on critical foreign and defense policy questions, more so than domestic policy issues. And here I'll just mention that I've got a new article coming out in Armed Forces and Society in the near future, which focuses on the differences between foreign and defense policy and domestic policy issues. And for that research, I extended this same frame, right? And I wondered whether or not veterans of the war on terror would have common positions on questions like how the military should be used to respond to protests in the United States or to border security challenges. And there, across the board, I found that partisanship and personal political ideology overrides a sense of commonality and perspective among war on terror veterans. I'll put it a different way. We see significant differences in how Republican war on terror veterans and Democratic war on terror veterans approach those questions of domestic security. Things like reforming the Insurrection Act or changing restrictions and statutory limits on what the president can do with soldiers and forces inside the country. So there are wrinkles and dimensions to this for sure, by the way, worthy of further investigation.
I don't know if you consider this, Dr. Lantis, but the issue of socialization, people have hinted at it in Russia in informal terms, not as a formal theory, about how Vladimir Putin and many key individuals from the Russian establishment have shared experiences in the KGB and also in the Russian armed forces. Did you consider that when you were thinking about your research on socialization in the United States and also your thoughts on socialization abroad?
Really interesting for us to think about the effects of socialization on individuals in a variety of circumstances, both in the United States and around the world. Just to play out the socialization literature a little further, this, of course, connects to areas of investigation like social psychology. A lot of political scientists have been curious about this as well, and then just psychology studies on socialization experiences. And amongst the dimensions that they develop out in their research are things like, what are the formative experiences? Socialization is most acute for older adults in their years of experience between the ages of 18 to 24, for example, researchers find. And so during those years, when we could imagine that some countries would have all the males or even all of their young people involved in compulsory military service, it fuses, forces, suggests that commonality of experience that socializes individuals into further thinking. So to keep consistent with what I've been discussing here in imagining ways to extend or pull or expand this argument about socialization experiences, I could easily imagine a connection between a jump from military experiences right over to things like training in intelligence or counterintelligence, training for bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. or around the world. Yes, it's an interesting set of expansion possibilities to these arguments.
When it comes to socialization and having shared experiences in the military, one of the things proposed by British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak prior to the election where he lost was the creation of a national service, more like a draft or a volunteer service. I still have to find, I don't know the exact details, for young males and females who graduate from school, are in their late teens. Do you think implementing a similar program, maybe a short military training program for every citizen once they cross the age of 18, where they get a chance to have this shared experience, maybe in military training or community service as an alternative, help build this common social identity that is lacking these days as America becomes fractured due to political sectarianism?
That's a great question. And boy, that taps into some really deep and long-standing debates, right, about whether these kind of experiences are important and, gosh, should even be required for consideration. Well, let me mention just a few historical connections that are pretty easy to make. Europe in the Cold War era. Many West European countries during the Cold War had compulsory military service requirements for young males in their society, hitting around age 18, with an alternative choice. And in many cases, it was civil service, right? Driving an ambulance or working in blood drives for a year or 2 years, 18 months in some cases. These experiences were important, shaping experiences for this generation of young people in countries like Western Europe. We see the same requirements set in South Korea for young males and in Israel and Turkey for both males and females. More historical, though, are deeper debates about whether or not these kind of experiences are incredibly valuable for personal development. I'm reminded of a scholar named William James, who now a century ago, made an argument for compulsory civil or military service for all young people as a way to promote development, maturation, build important skills for the future, etc. But let me make one more point about this, and that is that I teach on these topics in my classes. I teach classes like international security and a war on film class at the College of Wooster. And in those classes, no surprise, I bring up the scholarship and these debates. And I ask my students about whether or not they would be keen to consider these kinds of opportunities. I will tell you the universal answer is no. And I'll leave it there.
Coming to our last question, what are some areas that you think related to your model need more research? Now, if there's a PhD student or another scholar listening to this show today and would be interested in building on your model and maybe expanding a particular area that due to time constraints or any other reason you couldn't look at in much depth, what areas to look at and what areas to expand you'd suggest to this potential scholar who may be listening to the show?
Oh, that's great. And it raises all kinds of exciting possibilities, thinking about expanding or developing research in this area. And I'll start kind of back to the foundations of our discussion to suggest that the civil-military relations has a rich, ongoing, and lively debate running on this question about military experiences and their influence on current foreign and defense policy positions. So there's plenty of opportunity, I think, for contribution to the CMR, as we call it, literature, on debates related to these questions. And that could include both actual research focused on particular connections to be made, such as a larger N study than the work that I did in my book, Staying in the Fight. I could expand on this to the scores of contemporary war and terror veterans and their influence in the policy process, to related explorations in the CMR literature on societal views on these questions, for example, or some historic illustrations that could be good. Over in the political science realm, there are all kinds of opportunities for further development of this. The easy one, again, is the larger N approach to studying the relationships that I've suggested. One could also expand the policy or issue areas pretty dramatically. I have a few illustrations, case studies in my book focused on Veterans Affairs and public health, but there are so many other interesting aspects to that question that could be developed both in contemporary and historic sense for further research and expansion. And finally, I'd suggest this. I'd suggest that there is a rich and fertile area for further and deeper investigation out there through in-depth interviews and systematic engagement with veterans of all sorts, in politics and outside of politics, regarding their interest in concerns about domestic and foreign policy issues. My effort, talking to 40 or 50 experts, members of Congress, and staffers around Capitol Hill, I hope is only the beginning of what could be a larger research agenda to continue to expand these themes.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just listened to Dr. Jeffrey Lantis, author of the book, Staying in the Fight, How War on Terror Veterans in Congress Are Shaping U.S. Defense Policy. Jeffrey Lantis, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Strategic Wisdom with Andrew Jose is an initiative of Andrew Jose Media. The views expressed by guests on this show do not necessarily represent the official positions and opinions of Andrew Jose, Andrew Jose Media, and Strategic Wisdom.
Thank you for listening to Strategic Wisdom. Be sure to follow and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you are using to listen to this show in order to not miss out any future interviews and conversations that Andrew Jose will bring to you on this podcast. We're streaming on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Yandex, JioSaavn, Amazon Music, and many other podcast streaming services. Also, be sure to subscribe to Strategic Wisdom on Substack at strategicwisdom.substack.com and to follow Strategic Wisdom on Twitter and Instagram at StratWisdom. Do support our work by buying from our merch store. For more details, visit strategicwisdom.substack.com.